See, apparently showing on like. But this one credit.
I've had like things like that that come up on Fiverr, that sometimes it's similar names.
Totally, I'm like hoping it's just,
Yeah.
but then how do you prove that it's?
I think they do some processing kind of research things we got, but.
No, you're good. She said she wanted to plug her computer in, so we don't actually have you plug in. You're just gonna hop on the Zoom link and you're gonna share your screen there.
It's easy.
Besides, I didn't want to waste your time and I didn't want to interrupt.
No, always interrupt. So if she's admin, she's never had it.
I just came up yesterday, I haven't even asked. It's also like.
I just, you say we do this report, and the report is ever take place, sometimes there's mistakes a lot, just we just have to validate.
Right, I'm checking their declaration just to be sure.
Never
I'm
understand.
already under a lot of fire. This meeting insurance low, you know. I just representations saying that.
I mean, we got
This
certain.
realtor, you were not on the video call where I explained all these things.
That was the wheels or something.
So someone had student ran this little class with the title company, so I was like, oh, cool.
Okay. Oh,
And I'm like,
you brought that up.
and I'm like,
That's fine, though. It's okay.
that's all we're up. I'll look at it.
I'll take it. Good. Speak up, thank you. Keep working on the other files.
Okay.
There
So that's my thing, that it basically say, I'm only gonna bring, you don't play, you wanna play this way? that I'm not a conversion.
Were you able to find the registration link and everything?
Oh, yeah, I have.
Oh, okay, perfect. I just wanted to make sure you had everything before I
Totally.
departed forever.
Correct.
Not forever, but I'll be in the back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if I need anything. I think we're good.
Alright. See, certificates.
I'm the one live.
No, but you have to be live to get us the credit.
Yeah.
So. Are you gonna be there for this? Oh, okay, if you come in, you can stay there. Well, I would say that to open the track, you can hear it. So.
We're looking for a wasp nest this morning. Oh. The grass is so wet, my shoes are like so wet, it's so gross, I'm like. Yeah. No, what is one of the wasps this year? I replaced my traps, 2 traps twice already. We're gonna just pull them.
My neighbors have an apple tree now.
Oh,
But,
yeah, my neighbors have apples like that.
They fall and then when you end up with drunk wasps, yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's exciting.
Always exciting.
My dog away from, she immediately just goes right at him. But it's the squirrels that come to shoot the apples down. And
Yeah,
yeah, it's just a,
yeah. I took my kids yesterday to go pick the apples and then we did the, stamp with the paint.
yeah.
I remember doing that here.
Yeah.
Potatoes.
Look at y'all, ready to go? What's my other happy? Registration sheet, so you can get your CD credit, and then a certificate, somebody has to fill out and we'll sign for it. Sure.
More than enough, see what that is.
It's just the knowledge.
Yeah, it's just bonus.
Yeah, good to have the knowledge. So three of the certificates, so you're going, I'm gonna, we'll sign it. Good morning.
Thank you. Hi, Arden.
Martin?
Arden.
Arden, I'm good.
Met you yet.
No, we haven't met, nice to meet you.
You too.
I'm Dale.
Yes.
Great. Yes, you kind of do this. Yes, you could go on the sign the first meeting. Have a proof of the certificate. They don't make you do anything with it, but you get that for just. The flag right to your left, also if you want. Yeah. Wait, anybody possibly.
And she worked with my parents last year. We got the one, you read as the Bible, about it, who it wasn't.
My goodness.
Yeah, they're good. I'm actually living with them now. I mean, because of them, yeah. They were in contact with Margaret.
Small.
Yeah.
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 And another, that connection.
Oh, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah,
You're
I really
okay?
enjoyed working with you, so.
They're doing well?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I don't know if my grandparents are in the house too, so.
Did that happen right away?
Yeah.
Maybe, I'm sure we talked about that.
Yeah.
Good.
Like, it's super, so.
Of course, yeah, so the three generations.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. What did you do again?
A few months ago.
Twice. Morning, how are you? Okay, there you go. So. It's a top twist.
Alright, we'll get started. If you're in person, this is a 1 hour CE class, so make sure to sign the sign-in sheet. And I will sign your certificates at the end, and make sure to get that CE credit. If you don't know how that works, get audited, you just have to prove that you have those certificates. Anyone ever get audited? Yeah.
15. Oh, wow.
It's a really easy process, though. I mean, I just exactly got it wrong.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The random model.
Well, this class is maintaining homeownership affordability when the buyer has to finance the buyer's agency into their loan, and how we can structure the financing to be able to accomplish that. Can everybody hear me okay? Online? Good, okay, great. So here are some disclaimers about the course. Our calculations may be slightly off because some of the numbers have been rounded just for simplicity. All of these solutions are hypothetical examples. They should not be used without conferring with a licensed loan officer. We're gonna get kind of really into the weeds with lending. The idea is not that you are the lending expert, but that you have enough tools in your toolbox to be confident and show that you're the expert by alluding to certain solutions that are available when your buyer does have to pay your buyer's compensation. Each buyer's financial profile differs, and each solution may not be applicable to all buyers. Multiple solutions may be available for each example given. We're giving one or two, again, for simplicity and illustrations, but there's so many structures and options when we're in this situation to help our buyers. In most cases, we just chose the most cost-effective approach. I am not a licensed realtor. I do not attempt to advise on real estate terms or contract verbiage, and any reference to such are for illustration only. The buyer's debt to income, DTI, credit score, income type, income history, down payment, and property type will determine what solutions are available. And the examples given don't consider the qualification of each specific buyer. All loans given are 36-year terms, and buyer's agency compensation is assumed at 2.8% unless otherwise noted. All right, a little fun. Let's see if you have a little pen and paper. Write down, I'll give you like a minute. Just write down, see, we'll do a little contest and see who wins, who can get all this alphabet soup that we like to use in lending behind any of these terms. You're not allowed to participate.
Okay, can I help? Sounds like first word is maybe charade.
Guys?
Yes, who wants my cell phone?
Yeah, you can get different calls for that. Alright, I'll start it. LTV, anybody?
I don't know.
I don't know if I can actually, this works when I'm
Oh,
on PowerPoint, but maybe not on Zoom, that's okay. LTV is loan to value, what about CLTV? Combined loan to value. So that might be in the presentation, but
that's how you have a first and second mortgage together, the combined debt owing is that one.
yes. So combined loan to value would be that, you know, if you put 3% down on a conventional mortgage, your loan value would be 97. But if you then use a 4% second mortgage for down payment assistance, your combined loan to value is then 101. LA. Loan amount, yeah, BP. Down payment, VA.
This is the biggest change you guys had in your whole industry.
PP.
Purchase price.
Purchase price, nice, MI.
Mortgage insurance.
Yep. PNI,
Principal interest.
yep, PNC,
Unit payment.
yep, IPC. You get a bonus for this one. Interested party contribution, we're gonna talk about that a lot today. IPC, interested party contribution. DPA. Yep, FTHB. Yep, first time home buyer. ARM. That's where we're married, and IO. Interest only, everybody get them all? All but one?
Mhm.
Missing one, alright, Debbie. Is it the business one?
The IPC.
I can see, gotcha, awesome.
All right, we'll go shopping, Debbie. Okay.
Perfect. Okay,
The DPA.
Yeah.
so we're gonna talk about mortgage rate, we're actually gonna have the answers to these at the end. I'm gonna skip over this. So, how can the buyer's agency successfully be financed into the loan amount when compensation is not offered in the list price, right? This is what we're talking about today. The buyer's agency can be paid by the buyer. The buyers are permitted to pay the buyer's agency on any type of loan. They can pay it just out of pocket. It can be financed into any of these loans as well, up to the maximum loan to values. It can be included in the sales price, right? That's just business as usual. That's how we do it now. Or included in a seller concession. And seller concession, we're talking about IPCs, those are interested party contributions. Each loan type, and depending on occupancy, has different maximums. But the seller concession, when it's paying towards the buyer's agency, does not encroach on those limits. So they are allowed to be on top of those interested party contribution maximums. Buyer's agency compensation must be identified separately on closing disclosure. So here are those maximum interested party contributions. We talked about this a few weeks ago at team meeting. These are the maximums designed to pay for closing costs, prepaid taxes and insurance, really rate buy down. They cannot be towards down payments, that seller concession, that's the big piece. You're gonna run into issues with this when you there's two sides, right? This does not play into the buyer's agency. They can have a seller credit greater than, say, the 2% maximum for an investment property to pay the buyer's agency compensation, if it's written that way. These limits are important to know, and this is kind of a different subject, but when you are in a situation when you have a lot of credits. So sometimes people say, oh, we need to replace that sewer line, so we're gonna give a $20,000 seller concession. We don't have $20,000 in closing costs and prepaid taxes and insurance. We can't use that full amount of money, right? We cannot encroach on down payment. So that's where you have to be careful when, always including your lender when you talk about seller concessions for things. We can get creative, we can buy the rate down further, we can also collect up to 12 months of HOA dues at closing, and sometimes that buffers, and that's a cool negotiating tool too, if you have someone who's super payment sensitive, and that first year is gonna be challenging, maybe they're on a growth for business, or debt will be paid off in a year. Negotiating that full year of HOA to be paid by the seller is something that you can do, within these limitations. These percentages are calculated on the purchase price, not on the loan amount. The reason we call it a maximum interested party contribution and not just a seller concession is because this money can come from any of the parties in the transaction. And so, sometimes as a buyer's agent, you might be giving a credit towards your buyer. That is included in these interested party contribution maximums, as well as any lender credits that may be given to help pay for closing costs. All right. So the goals of this course is which buyers will require the buyer's agency compensation to be included as part of the price, which buyers will allow for a change to the financing structure to build in that compensation in the loan. When you're listing a home, thinking about what price range in our market is most advantageous to include that buyer's agency, further kind of convincing or persuading your seller to include that buyer's compensation, right? We all want that included. It makes our jobs easier. This just gives you further information to share with them on why they want to do that. When to work with your lending partner to determine the loan structure and maintain affordability, and how to keep the buyer's payment affordable if the buyer's agency compensation is financed into the loan. All right. So here's our maximum loan to values. This plays a huge role in our limitations of how we can finance in those buyers' compensation. With VA, as you know, that's 0 down. We do 100% loan to value. Same with USDA, as well as certain FHA programs. For the most part, FHA is that 3.5% down. That's the maximum. LTV is 96.5. Conventional 97. Down payment assistance, we can actually exceed that 100%. 90% loan to value on jumbo. Most all jumbos right now require 10% down. Those 5% products have kind of gone away. And we have an all-in-one loan. We're not going to talk about that too much here, but that's also a 90% loan to value. All right. So here are the maximum loan amounts in Colorado counties by loan type. The biggest one that we always look at is this 766,550. That in general is for the whole state of Colorado. If you're conventional financing, anything above that, you become a jumbo loan. So if you're buying, if you're selling a home at 780,000, you can still get a 5% down buyer. But once you're in the higher price range, you really eliminate those minimum down buyers. And so if you are on the thresholds for some of these, and your seller's saying they don't want to pay that buyer's agency compensation, you really have no chance of getting minimum down buyers that also have to pay for or finance in that buyer's agency compensation. Do you have something you want to add to that? Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll just touch on the, there's a higher limit for Fannie Mae. So this is the comment she made is totally accurate. That is at 3% down, which is the minimum Fannie Mae loan down payment. Your maximum loan amount is 766,550. If you want to go up to the, I don't know if you're going to talk about that part, the spread between that level and the next Fannie Mae level, which is 814,000 change, that difference becomes what's called a Fannie Mae high balance loan, which requires a minimum of 5% down, not 3% down anymore. So this is just for that minimum down payment.
Yeah.
And the rate is 0.75% higher anytime you exceed the 766,550. So we try as much as possible to get somebody with that lower loan amount to get the lowest rate, as long as they have the funds for down payment, or we can put a first and second mortgage together sometimes for that CLTV, combined loan to value to create getting the better loan. So that's why some of these different loan amounts there.
Yeah, and you'll see you have more wiggle room where we're at in Jefferson County. That loan limit is 816,500, meaning you can still finance 816,500 with only a 5% down payment, as Mitch was saying.
Yeah, that's the bottom of it versus high cost area.
Yeah.
So Boulder is higher because the cost of living is higher there for housing, and then the other, all of our normal counties we're used to working in is the 816,500. That becomes the Fannie Mae high limit loan or high balance loan. Anything above that is true jumbo loan. So it's no longer Fannie Mae guidelines, which are much more lenient than jumbo guidelines. So a lot to know. That's what this is about. But those numbers are very important when it comes to restructuring transactions.
Yeah, if you have a really high price listing and someone's coming in with minimum down, it might trigger, wait a minute, I don't think this financing actually works. Let me call that lender and see how they're gonna structure this and if that really makes sense. We're of course happy to be a resource as well. VA, I was like to show this back, no maximum loan amount, CMG will actually do a 0 down $5 million loan. Yeah,
Oh, really?
totally. I haven't seen that one yet, I'd like to.
I've
Yeah, no,
got
anybody,
$1.5 million VA loan.
really got 0 down.
Mhm. Big old payment each month, but they have the money, they have the income to support it. And we said, why should I tie my money up if I can get a 6% rate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a few case studies, you know, when you're in these scenarios where, the buyer's agency is not included in the price, how do we kind of move some numbers around to still make that payment affordable? Still make the money at closing affordable? So here's a nice, kind of chart comparison. So your standard might be, all right, selling the house for $600,000, my buyer is a 3.5% down FHA buyer. There's 0 seller concessions, the monthly payment is $3,751. There's no commission paid by the buyer, right? However, if we want to have the buyer responsible for that compensation, we can finance it in 2 different ways. Both of them involve increasing the price. Solution 1 being increasing the price enough to then get a seller concession, so that seller's still getting their $600,000 price, right? But they're paying the difference between this higher purchase price that will then allow the buyer to have $7,500 towards rate buy down, plus $16,800 to come up with that 2.8% buyer's agency and keep their payment the same. This also keeps their cash at close the same. All the money is just shifted within price and seller concession to pay that buyer's compensation, but even more so that we can try to get them a similar payment. We can also look at flipping them to conventional, which is a slightly lower down payment. We can have that price be a bit lower to still afford them a very similar monthly payment, still paying the buyer's agency. And as you can see, their cash at close is almost the same. So it's just shifting money around a little bit. Of course, they are financing more. As you can see, these loan amounts, that's the big shift here. They're still financing more, but they love the house. They want to make the payment affordable. They want to make this happen. Here's a strategic way where we can just move that money around. Everybody still gets paid. You still end up spending the same amount of money.
That makes sense. This is the big concept of this whole, actually meeting today is how can we maneuver funds so that you can still make the transaction happen and not have to worry about your compensation, the buyer's agency, compensation, to build it into either the price, the loan amount, and then ask the seller to come up with fewer dollars for helping create that opportunity, as opposed to saying we need $28,000 from you, otherwise we can't do the transaction.
Are you gonna share these slides with us?
I'm sorry.
Are you gonna share these slides with us?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
we're gonna put-
you may want to,
I keep
you may want to
pushing my
study.
buttons.
Yes.
But, the point again is there's so many different options that can be created. And like any other transaction you do, if you were to raise the price to cover things like we used to do, you still have to appraise, right? Versus the note at the bottom there, you still have to pass out to appraise at the value. You're trying to increase it to help the seller be able to pay and cover things.
And also good to include in your buyer presentation to show people that while they're gonna have to pay your agency, there's lots of ways to get there.
Correct.
And I think you can make the comment of, hey, if that seller would have included this in the first place, this is really where the price should have been.
100%.
And that's also further argument that the house should appraise. Okay, so here's another idea with $600,000 price with 0 down. This is the, 0 down. There's no wiggle room here. We have to build in that compensation into the price. There's really no other option. But if we want to keep that payment still affordable for that buyer, we might include not only the 2.8%, but also extra money to buy their rate down to keep that payment similar. So in this case, we could include the buyer's agency and try to negotiate a rate buy down on top of that. Include that in the price. So that is the 16,800 plus the 5,440, which gives us that higher price, gives us a higher loan amount, but keeps the payment affordable for the buyer. And this is something that we're doing now, whether you have to finance in the buyer's agency or not. Creative ways to get buyers in these homes to keep the homes affordable is just addressing upfront. Can we negotiate a higher price? Sure, maybe your loan amount's higher, but in the end of the day, what's more important to you? Is it your payment? And we can move money around to try to get that interest rate lower and get them the goal of having an affordable payment for the house that they love. Conventional price at 95% loan to value, we can finance up to 97% conventional financing if any of the buyers are first-time home buyers, or if they're home possible or home ready eligible. That is something that is designated by the location of the property they're buying. A home possible or home ready loan is a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac conventional loan, or they can put 3% down, or in this case, if the original plan was 5% down, we can just do their loan amount at 3% down to give them 2% towards that buyer's agency. And that is driven by the median income limit for that area. So if the buyer is at the median income limit for that area or lower, they are eligible for a home ready or home possible. They do not need to be a first-time home buyer in that case. And they also get a perk of a little better mortgage insurance. They just have to take a little class online. In this case, purchase price is $790,300 with a 5% down payment. Okay, this is your standard where the buyer is not paying the commission. Payment is around $5,000 a month. Now our solution would be, hey, instead of doing the 5% down, you're going to put 3% down, so that you have then more money to be able to pay at least 2% to that buyer's agency. And then you would just have to come up with cash or negotiate a seller concession for just that 0.8 amount to still get the full compensation. Okay. For financing more than the required down payment, but less than 20% down. So this would be if you're not a minimum down buyer, right? So we don't need to finance, we don't have only a 3% or 3.5% down. We have more wiggle room, right? In this case, the buyer is putting 10% down. So their conventional loan amount is $743,400. Principal and interest with mortgage insurance is $4,900 a month. And the buyer's agency is the 2.8%. Now, this is easy. We'll just say, okay, we're just going to increase your loan amount by the 2.8%. We don't have to get funny with purchase price. We can keep that the same. We just increase their loan amount to then pay the buyer's agency. But we might look at, all right, instead of increasing everything 2%, why don't we just have 0.9% of the purchase price to come up with a seller concession to lower their interest rate to get them that same monthly payment. So this is just a great scenario of keeping it simplified, not increasing that price and keeping a minimal change as much as we can to keep that payment the same for that buyer. Any questions?
Just another comment. The payment is so important to everybody, of course, as far as buyers go. So one of the goals in us creating this presentation, along with how do we adjust things so that it does keep that payment as close to the original payment, which they expected to have at the very beginning, was this. And so it only have a $1 difference is kind of interesting how it came out that way. But there's ways to massage there's so many variances or variables to creating the loan and the loan payment and the structure of the loan. That is the beauty of what we know how to do, number one, and two, that it's available to buyers given this change. And all of this, as you can see, is If the seller says, I'm not gonna pay any commission or any compensation to the buyer's agent, what do you do with that, right? So this is what this is all about, how do we make that still work, so the buyer can still buy the home that they ultimately wanna buy, and we're presenting them with another option to make it work. And in many cases, keeping their payment the same, even though we're adjusting the loan out of the purchase price. Which is the creative side of what we do, which is the fun part for us. Not asking someone for a bank statement, and why do they get a deposit from somebody? This is really fun and creative, and people go like, there's no way you can do this, and the answer is, we can, let me show it to you. Even imagine a first time home buyer having to kind of get their head around all this. There's a lot of education that goes on behind it. We haven't had, I don't know what your experience is, but I haven't had to do too much of this quite yet, because everything's so new. And if you're just filling in 29.1 and then just kind of negotiating from there on the contract, it's been pretty straightforward typically. But we have seen where sellers or buyers are paying compensation now, the remaining amount. So if the seller says, I'm just gonna pay 2.5, we're seeing 0.3 being assessed to the buyer, and then if they have the funds, great. If they don't, then this comes up. So that's where this all came from, at the very beginning of thinking through all this.
Yeah, I think it becomes a little less painful for that buyer, and also I think eases that relationship with the buyer when you know, if you're even talking hypotheticals and they're nervous, you know, if that comes up in conversation, what if I have to pay you, and how does that play out? You know, kind of having a calm response and say, all right, let's talk to the lender. There's so many creative ways where we can still keep this home affordable, and you don't have to cough up any more money out of pocket. So here is a closing disclosure for that scenario that we just went over. If you guys aren't familiar with this form, of course, the settlement statement is so much easier to look at. This is the government required lender form that we have to have signed at least 3 days before closing. And I'm just going to point out to you some of the key fields that you want to look for if your buyer is deferring to you to answer questions. So that first page is this first column here. You'll see the sales price, the loan amount, and interest rate. Your cash to close is on the very bottom of the first page. And then the second and third pages break down how we get there. So in this case, this is our standard. There is 0 points paid. They have the 6.75% interest rate. The selling agent commission is here, and not in this column. This is borrower paid. This next column is seller paid, right? So your standard transaction, it's going to be in that farther column. Here again on page 3 is that loan amount and their cash to close. Now, comparing to our other situation, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit. You'll see the sales price in this one and the one before, oh, that's a little slow, is the same. Where changes is our loan amount and our interest rate. And you'll see on the next page, we have that higher loan amount, but the lower interest rate, right? This is the strategy to keep that payment affordable. You'll see our cash to close on the bottom is nearly the same, right around that 85,000. What did change is the points paid, again, to get that lower interest rate. And then you'll see here's that buyer paid column. That is where they are paying the seller's agent commission. So if you're ever looking at that CD, you want to verify who's paying what, it's going to show in this column at the bottom of page 2. You'll see the listing agent, that's in the seller's column over to the right. They're paid by the seller. In this case, we're saying, all right, the buyer's going to pay. And then you'll see the seller credit that in this case we negotiated for that rate buy down to keep the payment the same is then on page 3, about halfway down. All right. So here are some other solutions for helping buyers pay agent commission. We haven't really talked about down payment assistance here. If you have a minimum down buyer, but they are exercising down payment assistance, we can say, all right, well, we'll still use your 3%. That pays your, the 2.8%, but we're going to add on this down payment assistance. It's going to change your terms a bit, but that pays for your down payment to compensate. And down payment assistance can pay towards the buyer's agency compensation. Just to give a brief explanation of how down payment assistance works. So, when a buyer puts down, there's, two main down payment assistance loans. And they just follow the same conventional and FHA loan rules, so you can have 3% down conventional loan or 3.5% FHA. That's your loan, it's a standard loan. The down payment assistance just tacks onto that for that CLTV, that second mortgage, to then come in and pay that down payment. And the most common down payment assistance is a 4% second mortgage. So it's 4% of that base loan amount, whether it's the 97% conventional or 96.5 FHA. They come in with that 4% second mortgage. However, they charge 1%, a 1% fee. So it's kind of like they give 3% of that loan amount to come in to help pay for that down payment. And in this case, of course, we can use that towards compensation. That second mortgage has no payment and no interest. It just has to get paid when the loan gets paid off, whether that's selling the house, maybe they just keep that same loan and you pay it off in 30 years, or they refinance. At that point, they do have to consolidate and pay off that second mortgage, that 4%. Okay? Sometimes we'll even use it, as a side note, maybe they don't have to pay the buyer's agency, but it makes more sense for them to pay off a car loan. Hey, get this 0 interest loan, let's pay off some other debt and help you get in the house, right? Again, we're just trying to keep things affordable, and that's a great way to kind of punt the debt and have it be 0 interest for paying off later with the equity that grows in the house. Borrowing from retirement assets, this is, I think, not well known that when you're buying a primary residence, you can typically borrow from your 401k without any penalty. Most 401k holders have the provision that you can only borrow 50% of the account up to a limit, usually about 50,000 is where they cap that maximum that you can borrow. But it has no penalty. And the interest that you pay often goes back to you as if it were, growing in that account. I looked at this for borrowing against a different asset of mine, and I would pay an 8% interest for that payback on the loan against that asset, but 7.5%, I think, goes just right back into the account. So I'm leveraging this money, paying very little debt to put it into a larger asset. And what's nice for loan qualifying is we don't have to count that payment against them. So if it makes sense, they can make that payment work, offsetting that loan against the 401k, then it really can help them get into a home and leverage that debt. Each account holder has their own rules, so they just have to look into that themselves. Of course, gift funds have to be from family. We have to document that the money does not need to be repaid, so that family member will sign a letter that we send to them that says this money is for the purchase of our grandson's house, he doesn't have to pay me back, and then we have to just source that money. And then Home Fund It, which is that CMG program where they can raise money for down payment. It might be in a situation, I kind of think of that as the Hail Mary of like, somehow this got missed, and now we need to gather more money. How can we do that? Maybe we spread that to our sphere of, people. This allows more reach for that gift funds, if you will, because there's no family requirement. And donors can donate online with a debit or credit card. There's no offline paperwork. Anyone can give. It's a maximum $5,000 per donor, but there's no campaign or maximum that they can't raise more than. There's no commissions or costs to those donors, no time limits. And this works for any loan program except down payment assistance programs, HFA and bonds. And again, this allows people to span their whole sphere and say, hey, I'm buying a house. Of course, we'd love to have it before contract, but if they're in a position where they know they're gonna have to pay that compensation, this could be a way to just boost their funds. I'm sure you guys are so sick of talking about contract verbiage. I feel like we talked about this to no end. I think what I've seen in all of contracts since this has come through is that everyone's completing either 29.1 or 29.3. In general, this part of the contract should be completed when that buyer's agency is being paid. We want to keep that section 4.2 for set aside for closing costs, paying down the interest rate, prepaid taxes and insurance. We really would like these, I think it's the most clear for these boxes to be totally separate for if that seller is gonna pay for closing costs on top of the buyer's agency.
That makes sense. That was a big one that was coming up all the time at the very beginning before we were even using the new contract of how do we add all compensation? We add it all in here, or do we separate it? And I imagine you guys will learn to separate it, but that's what this is about, is separating it. So it's very clearly defined what's going towards where, so that there's no misunderstanding of what the seller's going to pay for the buyer as far as their compensation, or their concessions or loan stuff versus your compensation.
Right,
So
we don't want compensation in this box. I think it gets a little too muddy and unclear. Sometimes you could double up funds or just, it wouldn't be transparent that that's indeed the intention of the concession.
I'm sorry, so where does the difference go again?
So if the compensation is being paid by the seller, this is all in this section of the contract. If then you're saying the seller is gonna pay the, any closing costs, you know, any concession separate from the buyer's agency, that is gonna be paid in section, put in section 4.2.
like we were doing prior to the new contract,
Yeah.
it was the same thing, seller concessions go there. Now you're just defining the buyer's agency compensation in 29.1, 2, or 3.
Got it.
Yeah, so we're just keeping those separate.
All right, so we had our appraisal management company on last week. They kind of shrugged this off. It's like, it's no big deal. This is normal. And I don't know about you guys, but that wasn't very satisfying for me. It's like, great, this is not business as normal. How can we make this work? You know, appraisals will not know if commission is included in the price of the subject without the MLS. But it does show on that contract, and appraisers get a copy of the contract when we order the appraisal. They have to have it. They want to know what the price is. And, you know, like they said last week, I think it was last week, I think he said 95% of the time, the appraiser is just gonna give you the price that's on that contract. Again, important to have those conversations up front. If the buyer's agency wasn't included up front, and then you do an amend to include it later, and that appraiser didn't get that amend increasing the price, that's where you're gonna have appraisal issues. You wanna make sure all that stuff is handled up front so that there's no change after the appraiser gets that initial, contract and amendments when the order is placed. How will appraisers know if commission was included in past or sold properties without the appearance of the compensation on the MLS? They don't. So if you are in a position where you think you're gonna have trouble with that appraised value and you need to do your homework for you, getting that information to the appraiser, you are totally able to do that. So that leads to the next question. Can lenders and realtors communicate with the appraiser during the appraisal process? Absolutely. We have to be careful and tread lightly. We can't sway value, but we can give factual data for them. So, you know, the most common one is we see with refinances is that person's done a ton of renovations in the short term after they've bought their home and they're saying, my home's worth so much more. We say, okay, well, let's document it and give that to the appraiser so they can really see what you put into it, what the cost was, and really include that in the value. That is allowed. You are okay to do that. And you can absolutely do that with your listings or buyers to just help support that value. Oh, I'm gonna go back to my mortgage trivia. Sorry. Okay, so a lot of this was addressed in the class, so we'll see how we answer it. This one was it. What loan type allows seller concession to pay off buyer's debt to qualify? So the seller can actually pay off the buyer's debt to help them qualify. Anybody know? You know? Home funded, no. VA loans. On VA loans, that seller can pay off that veteran buyer's car to help them qualify.
Yeah, we had a situation where there was alimony owing for another 9 months at like $700 a month, and the gentleman didn't qualify with that payment. So the seller paid 9 months of alimony, child support at closing to pay off, pay in full that payment. And then we didn't have to include it for qualifying because it got paid off at closing and the seller. Isn't that crazy? I mean, that's the only loan that will allow you to do that because it's helping the veteran and the goal is to help them in any way possible that makes sense. It was less than 10 months, which is a traditional known. If you have less than 10 months left on a debt, then you don't have to include it to qualify. The VA says specifically if it's over $100 a month in that payment, which almost every payment would be, then you have to include it. So that particular guideline is more restrictive for VA compared to like FHA and conventional. So we just said, well, why don't we just pay it? They did.
And then you have to go to the kid's birthday party.
Yes. Right. And the ex-wife is. That would.
What loan type will allow seller concession to exceed the maximum allowable percentage specifically to pay the buyer's agency? We talked about this at the very beginning, so if that interested party contribution, I'm gonna use the investment property because that's the hardest one. The maximum is 2% seller credit. How can I exceed that? What loan allows me to exceed that 2% maximum? VA, you're right. But it's actually all loans. All of them allow the seller to pay the compensation. It does not get included in that interested party contribution maximum. Okay, any loan type. Is the seller concession calculated on the loan amount, the percentage, that maximum? Loan amount or purchase price? Purchase price, yeah. So when you're looking at, okay, what is my maximum seller credit? You want to look at the percentage of that purchase price based on that table that we looked at. What loan types allow for 100% financing? VA?
100%.
100% or more?
Okay.
Sure. What's the rural housing?
USDA.
Correct. That's 100% financing, and then there are some FHA, and of course, down payment assistance also allows for 100% or more financing. What loan type allows seller concession to exceed the maximum allowable interested party contribution? Not for buyer's agency compensation, but just for rate buy down. So they're saying the maximum interested party contribution is 3%. But we can actually get even more money from the seller to pay for additional money towards rate buy down. It's the favorite loan of the hour.
2 letters.
VA, yeah. VA is creative and they want to help those veteran buyers. So hey, let's pay off their alimony or whatever we need to do to get this done. So that VA, I think if you took a picture or you reference the slides and say, oh no, I can only have a 4% seller credit maximum, I would say that's a little more fluid and consult with your lender if you're with VA to see if you can get even more than that. And what is the definition of a first-time home buyer? I talked about any first-time home buyer can finance up to 97% loan to value. They can have 3% down. Any first-time home buyer. What does it mean if you're a first-time home buyer? The obvious, you haven't owned a home ever. 3 years. Thank you. Or in the past 3 years. So if you have not had ownership in a home in the past 3 years, you are considered a first-time home buyer. There's also one other one. If you're at our divorce course, you would have learned. If you are the outspouse in a divorce and the only home that you own or have ever purchased is that marital home, you are then also considered a first-time home buyer. Define outspouse. the outspouse, if you're getting kicked out.
We're moving out of that house.
Yeah,
That's my guess, but I've not heard that.
Yeah, yeah, we like to say the house spouse and the out spouse.
Got
It's
it.
like calling your ex-husband or husband.
Oh,
Very similar kind of connotation there. My neighbor told me that one. She said, my husband did this, and I thought, my husband. He wasn't.
Okay, so there are answers. Okay. That's about it. You guys didn't interrupt me or have too many questions. You know, again, we reiterated this a lot. Your job is not to know how to structure financing, but it's, the ability to give confidence to your buyer that there are solutions, knowing when to talk to the lender, and also knowing how to work with your seller in, you know, pricing the home and explaining to them why there might be adjustments in this manner to help the buyer pay for their buyer's expenses.
Yeah.
Anything to add, or?
Well, one, thank you for presenting that. That's great information.
Thank you.
We kind of went through pretty quickly all these scenarios, and the scenarios are important to not know verbatim, but to know that they exist and there's ways to adapt to circumstances that pertain directly to your transaction. So keep open-minded to going, well, this feels like we're at a roadblock because they're not willing to pay any compensation. The buyer doesn't have their own cash to do it. There are ways to make that happen. Just make sure you have that conversation with your only lending partners that you even know every day you wake up, which would be Dale or myself. Be facetious, make sure your lenders, if you use other lenders, know how to do this, because it's crucial in making a contract for it come together. Is any of those contracts you've written so far since the changes, have you had any unusual circumstances where you had to adjust or adapt to compensation, or has it been fairly kind of normal, doing business as usual so far? Is that, then we found anything different? Pretty straightforward.
I had a question, because I feel like I've gotten mixed answers. Are you guys allowed to amend that original compensation agreement? Yeah. Okay. For some reason, I thought that was.
So we had a big conversation about that yesterday. Actually,
Okay.
another office I was doing a presentation at on their sales meeting. And the question, there were two parts actually. One was, if you ever use variable compensation, which would be if you're representing the seller, and a buyer walks in and says, I don't want to use any other realtor, I want you to be my, well, it would become a customer, right? Not, yeah, transaction, is it even called that anymore, it's still transaction, okay. And you had an agreement with the seller that you would charge X amount of day represent, if there was no other compensation needed. Would you have to disclose that to that new customer that you became the transaction broker in? Or would you not even have to be a transaction broker? Can't you just still be the seller's broker? You have to flip into a transaction broker. Number one.
You have to flip to a transaction.
But you should.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the customer scenario, was, well, if I agree to pay, if the sellers agree to pay me a certain amount, if I in turn only represent them, do you have to disclose that to that customer? Because the customer thinks they're getting a discount on the price because they don't have a realtor representing them, right? That's the whole concept behind what the customer thinks. And so and there was an attorney there who said, I don't think you have to, but she was gonna follow up on that. I don't know if anyone's had that scenario yet.
You have to disclose to a customer that you're getting paid
We
X.
haven't heard that.
I haven't heard it, yeah.
Yeah, it was an interesting question.
What I understand though, is that you cannot offer a variable commission. Correct. You have one commission.
To your seller. This was the seller side of this.
To the seller.
Right.
And no matter how you're treating that buyer,
You agreed to the
you
compensation.
agree to this compensation.
So, okay, so that
That's
was
what I've heard. Is that what you?
that's
You don't get compensation from the customer.
correct.
But
That's
you
correct.
just get
Just from the seller, because you're representing the seller, right?
exact compensation. It's not variable.
Yeah, whatever it is that's in there.
So then.
Right, so
that's-
if you're getting 5.6, you're getting 5.6 whether they have an agent or not.
Yeah, now can you adjust that though? Can't you adjust it down?
You can always amend.
Yeah, okay, so that goes back to your amended question, that's the initial question,
Yeah.
it's triggered that for me from yesterday is, can you amend? And that came up, and the answers that people talk about, if you're amending for the buyer, so let's say you submit at 29.1, you want 2.8%. They come back and say, we want to make this transaction happen, but we'll only pay 2.5%. But your buyer's agency says 2.8%. And so your buyers agreed to pay the additional 0.3. Could you amend that amount to then reduce your compensation to the buyer if you decide to do that after the fact? And the answer is yes. But what if you had to go the other way? What if you said, I'll do it for 2, which probably most people won't, but if you did, then now you have to go up to 2.5, could you increase it? Right, and obviously the answer is no, you couldn't, so.
I heard you can.
Yeah.
List an amend extended broker to your buyer agency. But with full disclosure and the conversation that we had around that was, aren't they gonna want that bonus? And so can you?
Would you?
We've heard,
Yeah.
yes, you can. Will you? Should you? That's a different conversation.
Yeah, which will be a tough conversation.
Yeah.
Probably, if you've already set it up one way. And then the third part to that comment was, so if they did and everyone agreed to it, what about the financing side of it? So what does a lender do now need to know and get involved with? The buyer's now paying funds for your compensation that we must confirm and validate they have to pay for it at closing.
Well, aren't you gonna get that on either the contract or the amend?
But this is an amendment afterwards. So let's say you go under contract, everyone's agreed, and then something changes during the contract where now it's like, okay, now it's going to happen. Because
I think the
we did
only
some of this
time
manipulation.
It would change during the contract, right, would be maybe if there's inspection items and you're gonna help out there to get to $1. But you're gonna negotiate what that compensation is gonna be with your contract, whether it's an initial offer, a counter, or an amend. But once you're under contract, that's not what you're gonna be talking about.
It shouldn't change,
Yeah,
but if it should, but if it does, I mean, all the letters are gonna happen
Yeah.
somewhere along the way,
yeah.
just the nature of our industry. So we were saying, well, if that happened, what do you end up doing?
You stay in really close contact with your lender
Yes,
all the way through.
before you make any of those changes, you go, do they even have the funds to do this? And our job now with all this shift is looking at things like that, just in case something happens along the way. Do they have any additional funds or have resources, i.e. a retirement account or a family for gift funds, which, or whatever the case is. So there's a lot of different variations to that. But it's changed, that's what's shifted quite a bit, is the attention to those kinds of details, so that we don't lose the transaction because we didn't think through it from the very, very beginning.
And please understand that these guys are special, right? They aren't lenders that just try and put your buyer into one box, and if the numbers don't work, the numbers don't work. Or maybe they work, but they're not in the buyer's best interest. These guys are looking at all of those different options to provide the best opportunity for your buyer. And I think that is so, so huge when you're in this competitive environment and being able to also show your buyer your value, right? Because your lenders are part of your team and they're gonna work really hard to find the right opportunity for you, just like I'm gonna work hard to find the right property.
And you probably made one really good comment in that is if you're having to compete against other offers, and if one agent comes in and says, I just want the seller to pay my compensation at 2.8 for $30,000 or $20,000, and you can come in and say, well, we can do it where we only need $7,500 because we've been able to adjust our loan amount and price, et cetera. From a seller's perspective, your offer is going to be way more desirable to consider versus the one that just says pay me the $20,000 in compensation or the bottom line shifts. And that's really where it stands out.
I'm sorry, seller doesn't care how they get there, they just care about their net. Buyer doesn't care how they get there, they just care about their payment and their cash to close, right? So all of this mumble jumble helps them out, but at the end of the day, here's what the two parties care about.
Correct. And the mumbo jumbo is this that we talked about today.
That's where we throw it in your
It's the fun
court.
part, yeah, that's, yeah.
Totally, and I know we got really granular, and it totally was feeling like mumbo jumbo in your brain and mine too sometimes, but it's just a great way to illustrate how it really is possible in so many different ways.
your buyers don't expect you to have all of that intricate knowledge, right? You don't have to know that, but you have to know where to find it, and you will get that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and we would give you guys the highlights. Here's what we did. We raised the price, we lowered the compensation, and we raised the loan amount, but the payment remained exactly the same. That's why the buyers are okay in moving forward.
And you're the
You just
hero.
need to know those 3 points in case you get asked about that for some reason.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
You can pass this into the kids up here, I will sign this. Yeah, press sign, you will need it to go.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to see everybody. We'll see you in an hour, or not an hour, half hour. Yeah, thank you.